Imagine you are walking along a gray, windswept beach. The sky is heavy with clouds, the sea moans like a forgotten memory, and sitting there, on the edge of existence, is a man locked in a chess match with death. What would you do at that moment? Try to win. Try to delay the end. This iconic scene from Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal didn't just etch itself into the history of cinema for its haunting visuals. It hit us in the gut because it reflected something eerily familiar, a deep, lingering question we all carry but rarely admit. Is there any meaning at all to this strange game we are playing? The knight, returning from war, is not seeking victory. He is desperate for understanding. And if we are honest, aren't we all? In today's world, we don't face death on a literal beach, but we confront it in more disguised forms. In the anxiety that creeps in during sleepless nights, in the moments we freeze before making life-altering choices, in the subtle discontent that colors our most successful days. We crave certainty, not because we are weak, but because we've been taught that certainty equals safety. Self-help books, 10-step plans, productivity hacks, even spirituality. They promise a formula, a way to sidestep the unbearable ambiguity of life. But what if that promise is the real trap? The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard saw through this long before modern gurus repackaged age-old fears in sleek typography. He suggested something almost scandalous, that life is not a problem to be solved, but a paradox to be embraced. He was not dismissing reason. He was exposing its limits. When we treat life as an equation to balance, we subtly become spectators, not participants. We observe ourselves endlessly, thinking, journaling, refining, optimizing. But in the process, we forget how to actually be. Why do we do this? Because existing, fully, vulnerably, is terrifying. Kierkegaard observed that we are finite creatures haunted by the infinite. We live in the now, yet yearn for something beyond. Immortality, purpose, absolution. That tension, that longing, is not a glitch in the system. It is the system, and instead of facing it, we build elegant fortresses out of philosophy, religion, moral codes, anything to avoid sitting in the raw space between knowing and not knowing. The chessboard becomes our comfort zone. Like Bergman's knight, we think if we just move the pieces in the right order, if we read enough, work hard enough, believe sincerely enough, we might outmaneuver the existential dread. But Kierkegaard whispers something uncomfortable into our ear. You won't win this game. Because the game itself is a distraction, this is not nihilism. Quite the opposite. It is the birth of authenticity. Kierkegaard points to something that few dare to articulate, that real life begins the moment we step away from the board. Not because we have solved the puzzle, but because we have finally understood that it is not meant to be solved. Let that sink in. The act of trying to solve life is what keeps us from living it. Maybe the need to have all the answers is a more seductive form of paralysis than ignorance ever was. The knight thinks he is buying time, but time isn't the prize. Presence is. And so the challenge is no longer about escaping death or mastering life or reaching some elevated state where everything finally clicks. It's about leaning into the unresolved. It's about allowing yourself to feel the confusion, the fragility, the aching beauty of a question that might never be answered. Because to live, truly live, is not to dominate existence. It is to surrender to it. Not passively, but passionately, with both eyes open, with trembling hands and a heart cracked wide enough for meaning to seep in. not from logic, but from experience. And that is where we will go next. Has this ever happened to you? You are deep in thought, trying to map your life like a carefully constructed blueprint. Every decision weighed, every emotion dissected. You believe, truly, that if you just think hard enough, you will arrive at a conclusion. A clean resolution, a moment when the fog clears and everything makes sense. But the harder you try, the more distant that moment becomes. The more deeply you analyze, the more slippery the truth feels, as if life, like a dream, fades the moment you reach out to grab it. Søren Kierkegaard knew this intimately. He called it the tragedy of the intellect. We think our minds are the crown jewel of human evolution, and yes, they are marvelous, but they can also be our jailers. Because when we believe we can rationalize our way to peace, we subtly reduce life to a mechanism, a system to decode, a sequence to optimize. The soul, however, is not an algorithm. We are taught to idolize intellect, from childhood through academia to spiritual lectures. But Kierkegaard challenged this worship. He argued that the more we live from the neck up, the more life leaks out through the cracks in our overthinking. That endless inner monologue, the one rehearsing conversations, imagining worst-case scenarios, analyzing motives. It does not bring us closer to the truth. It isolates us from the present, from each other, from ourselves. And the scariest part, we often don't even notice when it happens. We become spectators of our own lives, commenting from the sidelines, judging each move, trying to predict outcomes. But we are not really in it. The real moments, the laughter that bubbles up unexpectedly, the sting of heartbreak, the awe of watching someone be completely themselves. Those don't come from thinking. They come from presence. Kierkegaard saw this clearly. He was not anti-intellectual, far from it. But he believed intellect should serve life, not dominate it. And yet, most of us live the other way around. We treat emotion as a weakness, instinct as unreliable, ambiguity as the enemy. But these are the very gateways into authentic existence. Remember the knight on the beach? He's not losing because he is weak. He's losing because he is absent, absorbed in questions, theories, bargaining with death. He misses the sacred moments unfolding right before him. The simple joy of a smile, the breath of wind, the nearness of another human soul. He's sitting at the board, yes, but his life is happening somewhere else entirely. This is not a condemnation, it is a mirror, because many of us do the same. We think if we can just plan enough, study enough, be right enough, we will escape the chaos. But Kierkegaard dares us to consider, what if the chaos is not something to run from, but something to dance within? What if the goal is not mastery, but surrender? Think of how many times we avoid risk because we are waiting for certainty. We wait for the perfect timing, the perfect idea, the perfect emotional state. But perfection is just another name for paralysis. Kierkegaard calls this procrastination not in the lazy sense, but in the existential sense. We delay living in hopes of safety, but safety never comes. Only more waiting, more thinking, more pieces shuffled around a board that can never deliver what we seek. That is the real tragedy. But here is the turning point, and it is one Kierkegaard urges us to consider. If we cannot outthink death, and if we cannot outmaneuver uncertainty, it is time to try something different. The boldest move is not to double down on logic, but to step off the board entirely. To stop solving and start showing up. To feel, to fail, to wonder, to weep, to love, without guarantees. That, Kierkegaard suggests, is where life begins. In the unknown, in the unmeasured, in the unsolvable. And in the next part, we will begin to see how we navigate that terrain through the aesthetic, the ethical, and finally, the religious stages of life, not as abstract philosophies, but as vivid attempts, some desperate, some noble, to find meaning in a world that refuses to be pinned down. What would you think if I told you that every choice you have ever made, every ambition chased, every regret nursed, every distraction clung to, might be a quiet attempt to escape the terrifying freedom of being alive? Kierkegaard saw this, not with cynicism, but with compassion. He understood that we don't run from life because we are lazy. We run because it is overwhelming. The sheer weight of being conscious, of knowing we are free but finite, presses down on us like the gravity of the soul. So we cope. And the ways we cope are what he called the stages of life: aesthetic, ethical, and religious. Not abstract theories, but deeply human modes of being. Our emotional armor against the ache of existence. Let's start with the aesthetic stage. And if we are honest, it is where many of us begin and often stay. In this stage, life is a buffet of sensations. The next pleasure, the next thrill, the next validation. It is scrolling through social media, chasing flirtation, jet-setting for the gram, romanticizing spontaneity, all in the name of feeling alive, without ever being rooted in life itself. It is intoxicating, isn't it? We call it freedom, but it is a mirage, because the moment pleasure passes, and it always does, we are left emptier than before. Kierkegaard saw the aesthete as someone constantly avoiding confrontation with their own emptiness. They fear routine because routine makes the silence louder. And in that silence, anguish creeps in. Not dramatic, existential torment, but a dull, aching boredom. The kind that no playlist, no dopamine hit, no new lover can cure. Think of Don Juan, endlessly seducing, but never fulfilled. Not because he lacks charm, but because he is trapped in a cycle of needing the next thing to distract him from himself. That is the curse of aesthetic life. It promises freedom, but delivers fragmentation. Eventually, if life doesn't collapse under the weight of its own superficiality, some move to what Kierkegaard calls the ethical stage. There is a hunger for stability, purpose, coherence. It is the turn toward structure, marriage, career, integrity, social contribution. At last, responsibility enters the frame, and with it, a feeling of moral clarity. This shift is profound. The individual begins to see themselves as accountable, not just for what they feel, but for who they are becoming. They value consistency, reliability, and justice. They trade momentary pleasures for a longer, more grounded form of meaning. But even this is not the end, because Kierkegaard, with almost surgical precision, shows us how even ethical life can become a new kind of illusion. Because deep down, moral codes, societal roles, even virtuous behavior can become ways to avoid the radical unpredictability of existence. We become good people, but sometimes only because we are terrified of the unknown, of chaos, of facing the truth that life will never be fully under our control, even when we are doing everything right. The ethical person might follow rules, honor traditions, show up for others, and still feel the abyss lurking beneath the surface. And that, Kierkegaard says, is where the third stage calls from, the religious stage. But let's be clear, he's not talking about institutional religion. This is something deeper, wilder, more personal. This is the terrain of paradox, of risk, of surrender. The religious stage is when a person stands naked before the unknown and says, "I will live anyway." It is not about believing in dogma. It is about leaping, without a net, into the arms of something greater than comprehension. It is not a denial of the intellect or the ethical. It is the transcendence of both. It is when the individual accepts with trembling reverence that life cannot be solved, only inhabited. The leap is terrifying. It is often lonely, but it is also where authentic freedom is born. And it is here, in this most mysterious and paradoxical stage, that Kierkegaard introduces one of his most haunting ideas, the teleological suspension of the ethical, a concept that asks, what happens when your deepest calling conflicts with every moral rule you have lived by? When the call to be true to yourself requires sacrificing the very values that once gave you structure? That is where we go next. Today, perhaps more than ever, we are taught to believe that doing the right thing, following the rules, honoring our values, living ethically, will lead to peace. But what if life throws you into a moment where doing the right thing feels like a betrayal of your very soul? What then? This is not a hypothetical question for Kierkegaard. It is the core of one of his most provocative and unsettling insights, the teleological suspension of the ethical. A phrase so dense it sounds like a scholarly puzzle, but at its heart is a human cry. What happens when our highest truth demands we walk away from everything we thought was good? To answer this, Kierkegaard doesn't give us a theory. He gives us a story. A chilling, sacred story we have heard so many times it is easy to forget how disturbing it really is. Abraham sacrifices his beloved son Isaac, not because he hates him, but because he believes God asked him to. And Abraham obeys. He acts fully, without any moral justification that makes sense to human reason. What are we supposed to do with that? To most, this sounds like madness, or worse, cruelty. How could Abraham possibly be a hero in this story? How could any ethical framework condone this? But Kierkegaard is not asking us to judge the story. He's asking us to enter it, to feel the anguish, the silence, the solitary torment of a man who can't explain his actions, who can't appeal to law or virtue, because what he is obeying is not human law. It is something absolute, something beyond. Kierkegaard calls Abraham the knight of faith, not because he is noble in a traditional sense, but because he dares to walk alone in a paradox. He suspends the ethical, not out of convenience, but out of necessity. And here is the haunting catch. If God doesn't exist, then Abraham is a murderer. There is no in-between. This is the unbearable tension of faith. It is not certain. It is not compatible. It is not dogma. It is a choice made in the dark, in trembling, in contradiction, and still made. The knight of faith doesn't get applause. He gets isolated. He carries out his act with no guarantees, no moral high ground, no proof, only a deep, visceral knowing that this leap is his to make, and no one can make it for him. Now, why does this matter to you and me? Because Kierkegaard isn't just talking about ancient patriarchs or religious fanatics. He's talking about us, about the moments when life demands we go against the grain, when we leave a marriage everyone thinks it is perfect, When we walk away from a career we have built for decades, when we choose authenticity over approval, even if it means being misunderstood, judged, or alone. In those moments, the ethical codes we once held dear may no longer serve us, not because they are wrong, but because something deeper calls us. Something raw, intuitive, and impossible to prove. And this is where Kierkegaard separates the knight of faith from the criminal or the fool. The knight doesn't act out of selfish impulse. He is not chasing pleasure or power. He acts with reverence, with anguish, with love, and yes, with fear and trembling. Because true faith, Kierkegaard insists, always involves risk. There is no confirmation email from the universe, no guarantee that we are right. That is what makes it faith. We all want to live with integrity. But what do we do when integrity itself demands we abandon the very framework we once trusted? Kierkegaard doesn't offer an easy answer. In fact, he offers no answer at all. He offers a mirror, a confrontation, a challenge. Are you willing to live without safety nets? Because sometimes, to be fully alive, we must sacrifice not what we hate, but what we love most. And in that surrender, something extraordinary happens. A new kind of freedom begins to bloom. Not the freedom of having no rules, but the freedom of having risked everything for something only you can feel. And yet, this freedom is not the final word. There is still something more. Because what carries us through these terrifying choices, what allows us to leap when there is no certainty, is something Kierkegaard calls the leap of faith. Now, don't be fooled by the phrase. This is not the soft, comfortable kind of faith we often hear about. No cozy beliefs, no guaranteed salvation, no spiritual Instagram quotes to fall back on. Kierkegaard's leap is brutal. It is raw. It is a surrender into the terrifying unknown, with no rope, no net, and no one to applaud you for making it. Why leap at all? Because sooner or later we arrive at the edge of reason. We exhaust every theory, every argument, every philosophical system. We analyze, organize, strategize. And yet, the fundamental contradictions of life remain. Love and loss, hope and despair, purpose and randomness. Reason can describe these things, but it cannot resolve them. And when thought reaches its limits, when it is no longer enough to understand life but to live it, something inside us knows it is time to jump. But let's be clear, the leap is not a descent into ignorance. It is not blind belief for its own sake. It is not about abandoning your mind. In fact, you must use your intellect fully before you can leap at all. The leap only becomes necessary after you have seen the full extent of reason's reach and its tragic failure to explain the human experience in total. Faith, then, is what happens when we confront that failure and choose to live anyway. Kierkegaard compares it to someone leaping from a burning building. You don't know if there is anyone down there to catch you. You don't know if you will survive, but staying where you are means certain death. So you jump, not out of certainty, but out of necessity. The necessity of being true to something you feel but cannot prove. The necessity of choosing life, even when it makes no sense. That is the terrifying beauty of it. Faith begins precisely where thinking ends, and that is why so many resist it. We want assurances, we want proof, but Kierkegaard insists, if there were proof, it wouldn't be faith, it would be knowledge. And life is not something to be known, it is something to be risked. This leap of faith is not confined to religion. It echoes through every act of authentic living. When you fall in love, truly love, you leap. when you create art that exposes your soul. You leap. When you leave behind a safe life for a truer one, even when you're shaking with fear. You leap. Every act of real courage, every moment where you choose to live fully in the face of uncertainty, is a leap. But that leap is not grand or dramatic most of the time. It is quiet, invisible. Often it looks like getting out of bed when your spirit feels broken, starting over when your past keeps pulling you back, trusting yourself when the world is screaming doubt. These are leaps too, sacred ones, and they happen in private, away from applause, in the silence of your soul. Kierkegaard's point isn't that you must leap once and be done. No. Life asks you to leap again and again. Every day, in some way, you will be called to risk, to love without guarantees, to speak when your voice trembles, to create when you fear failure, to live without a blueprint. And here is the paradox. The leap never eliminates fear. It walks alongside it. The knight of faith, as Kierkegaard describes, does not lack trembling. He feels the anguish fully, but he leaps anyway because he has chosen to live as a participant, not a spectator, to dance with life, not debate it, to say in the face of chaos, yes, I'm still here. This is not just philosophy, it is a way of being. But now that we have stood at the cliff's edge, felt the vertigo, dared the jump, a question still hangs in the air, waiting to be answered. What does it mean to live like this every day? What happens when you stop playing chess with death and begin dancing with life instead? That's what we will explore in the awakening of true wisdom and a life unshackled from the need for guarantees. After all the struggle, the philosophies, the ethics, the chess game with death, Kierkegaard doesn't lead us to clarity. He leads us to a far more dangerous gift. Freedom. Not the surface kind, not the right to choose your latte kind, but the kind of freedom that leaves you trembling because now, nothing and no one is coming to save you. And in that terrifying space, something astonishing is born. The beginning of your real life. When the knight finally lays down his pieces, not in defeat, but in understanding, the game itself dissolves. There is no checkmate because there never was a board. Only a man staring at the waves, finally feeling the moment he's been trying to control. And in that moment, stripped of answers, theories, and guarantees, he is freer than he has ever been. This is the wisdom Kierkegaard offers. It is not the wisdom of clever insights or spiritual sound bites. It's the wisdom of walking into the unknown with your whole being. Trembling, perhaps, but no longer trying to escape. He shows us that wisdom isn't knowing more. It needs less. Not because life became simpler, but because you stopped needing it to be. This is where many people misunderstand Kierkegaard. They think he is a philosopher of despair, but he is not. He is a philosopher of possibility. He believes the human spirit is capable of enduring the absurd, the paradoxical, the chaotic. Not by fixing it, but by choosing to be present within it. You see it in how we live now. How so many drift through their days on autopilot, haunted by the fear they are wasting time, yet too paralyzed by doubt to act. We don't want to leap. We want to rehearse. We don't want to live. We want to simulate. Kierkegaard's voice cuts through the fog. Stop watching. Step onto the stage. He dares us to abandon the role of spectator, because that is what most of us have become, analysts of our own lives. We talk about passion, but we rarely burn. We talk about change, but cling to routine. We ache for meaning, but keep outsourcing the search. And the tragedy? Most of us are not even unhappy. We are numb, suspended in a fog of endless potential, afraid to commit to any path because it might be the wrong one. But Kierkegaard is not offering reassurance. He is offering permission. Permission to feel the vertigo and leap anyway. Permission to fail, to fall, to love, to lose. He invites us into the ferocious aliveness that exists just beyond the edge of our comfort zones. And he insists, the point is not to remove anxiety. It is to move with it, to ride it like a wave instead of letting it crush you. And here is where something unexpected emerges. Joy, not the shallow happiness of distractions, but the deep joy that comes from showing up. Fully, raw, unarmored. It is the joy of dancing in the rain rather than waiting for the sky to clear, of being alive without a script. Because once you leap, you no longer need the world to make sense. You only need to be in it, fully awake, fully responsible, fully free. So what does this life look like? It looks like loving someone without knowing if it will last. It looks like pursuing a dream with no promise of success. It looks like being kind, not because of karma or reward, but because it feels right in your bones. It looks like living, not to prove something, not to perfect something, but because you finally realized that living itself is the point. Kierkegaard leaves us here with a possibility. The possibility of living without guarantees. The possibility of being reborn, not through answers, but through courage. And that leads us to the final question. What happens when you finally stop trying to solve life and simply begin to live it? That is the doorway to the last and most vital part of our journey. What would you think if I told you that the very thing you have been resisting, the uncertainty, the chaos, the aching unknowing, is exactly what will set you free? We have been taught to fear the unknown, conditioned to chase clarity, structure, permanence, to believe that once we finally figure it out, we will be at peace. But here, at the end of Kierkegaard's labyrinth, something radical becomes clear. Peace doesn't come after the struggle. It is the surrender, not the passive kind, not giving up, but giving in, into life, into now, into the exquisite fragility of being human. And in that surrender, something shatters. Not you, but the illusion that you were ever broken. The truth is, there is no final answer, no grand meaning waiting behind the curtain, no manual for how to live without mistakes. What Kierkegaard gives us isn't resolution, it's release. The release from needing certainty, from needing to be right, from needing your life to fit some idealized script. He gives us the audacity to exist as we are, wounded, searching, trembling, and still rise. Because life isn't solved, it is experienced. The knight in the seventh seal, once locked in a desperate chess match with death, represents all of us. We try to delay the inevitable, believing we will find a strategy, some mastery, that will make death irrelevant or at least distant. But Kierkegaard whispers, you were never playing against death. You were playing against your own fear of life. And now it is time to stop playing altogether. To get up from the board, to walk away from the illusion that existence is something to outthink. You need the courage to move without it. The truth Kierkegaard leads us to isn't wrapped in answers. It is wrapped in tension, contradiction, and risk. Life isn't waiting to be solved. It is asking to be lived, fully and unapologetically, even when every step feels uncertain. Real wisdom doesn't promise to silence your fears. It teaches you how to walk beside them, how to let your questions burn and still move forward anyway. To live, not by calculation, but by presence, not to escape anguish, but to allow it to deepen your connection to what is real. And here is the most unsettling truth of all. No one else can do it for you. Not the philosophers, not the systems, not the beliefs you have clung to. You stand alone in front of your life, but not empty-handed. Somewhere beneath the noise, there is still that quiet pull urging you forward. Even now, even here. Kierkegaard isn't handing you another framework to master. He is inviting you to leave the frameworks behind, to stop measuring your life by outcomes and finally begin to feel it in all its pain, all its wonder, all its terrifying freedom. So pause for a moment, not to analyze, but to notice. What part of you has been waiting to come alive? If this reflection touches something within you, consider subscribing the channel. Your likes and comments not only inspire us, but also help us connect with others who may need to hear this message. The next video is already waiting. This is not the end. It is the invitation to truly begin our journey.